But very importantly, tomorrow tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start.
Canadian energy exports would escape unscathed. But the U.S. president says tariffs on oil are happening in just a few weeks at 10% instead of the broader 25%.
Having tariffs is never a good thing, right? Like, this will have a huge blow to Canadians and our economy.
You don't get a lot of firsts these days, but for the first time, Canadian liquefied natural gas is heading overseas.
And if the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will.
The world wasn't supposed to change with a single ship. Yet, on June 30th, 2025, it did. The Gaslog Glasgow pulled away from Kitimat, British Columbia, carrying 2.66 million tons of liquefied natural gas, not south into the familiar arteries of U.S. pipelines, but across the Pacific toward Japan, South Korea, and China. With that departure, 30 years of near-total Canadian dependence on America's energy market cracked in an instant. For decades, Washington could count on its northern neighbor to deliver gas at bargain prices, securing an invisible advantage worth billions every year. Ottawa, meanwhile, accepted the cost, nearly $9 billion annually lost in discounts, because there was no alternative. But this voyage made one thing undeniable: Canada has found the exit. By opening a Pacific lifeline, it has dismantled America's quiet grip over its energy exports. Analysts warn that what looks like one shipment could actually be the opening shot of a new era, where Canada stops playing the role of silent supplier and instead competes head-on in the most lucrative energy markets in the world. The question now is unsettling. If Washington no longer controls Canada's gas, does it risk losing its leadership of the global energy order itself? Before we dive in, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content matters. That first ship out of Kitimat didn't sail in a vacuum. It sailed into a storm created by Washington itself. Only months earlier, on March 4, 2025, the Trump administration had imposed sweeping tariffs, 25% on Canadian goods and 10% specifically targeting energy. Overnight, the very pipelines that once carried 8.8 billion cubic feet of Canadian natural gas into the U.S. each day were saddled with costs that made them uncompetitive. By the third quarter of 2025, the result was impossible to ignore. Exports of Canadian gas into the United States plunged by more than 30%. For decades, American cities had counted on steady northern supply to keep prices predictable, but now even that foundation was crumbling. Enbridge, one of North America's largest pipeline operators, scrapped a $1.4 billion expansion project to California. States like Oregon and Washington, long dependent on Canadian gas to stabilize their grids, suddenly found themselves short of supply and exposed to volatile spot markets. The transformation was brutal. The U.S., once the gatekeeper of Canadian energy, found itself on the outside looking in. Tariffs meant to demonstrate strength had instead fractured a cross-border relationship built over generations. And as Canada opened its Pacific outlet, Washington's grip over its northern neighbor dissolved into air. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It's how we keep uncovering what others won't say. If tariffs tore the old system apart, Kitimat provided the escape hatch. Nestled on the rugged Pacific coast of British Columbia, this deepwater port is more than just infrastructure. It is geography weaponized. Unlike most North American ports, Kitimat's natural depth means it can host the world's largest LNG carriers without costly dredging or constant maintenance. What looks like a quiet inlet on the map is, in reality, one of the most strategic gateways in global energy. The advantage doesn't stop at depth. From Kitimat, LNG cargoes can reach Asia in just 10 days, slicing transit times in half compared to U.S. shipments routed through the Panama Canal. That gap is not just about days saved, it's about billions in reduced transport costs and the ability to lock in contracts with buyers who prize speed and reliability. Most importantly, Kitimat severs the last thread of dependence. For the first time, Canada's energy exports bypass the U.S. continental system entirely. No pipelines crossing borders, no tariffs waiting at checkpoints, no political bottlenecks threatening to choke supply. In a single stroke, Canada positioned itself not as Washington's junior partner, but as a direct competitor in the race to dominate LNG trade flows into Asia. If Kitimat provides the geography, technology, and indigenous leadership provide the model. LNG Canada is not framed simply as another export project. It is being built as a showcase of what a modern energy system can look like when clean power and local ownership converge. Unlike traditional liquefaction plants that rely heavily on fossil fuels, the entire process here is powered by hydroelectricity. That decision slashes emissions to levels nearly unmatched anywhere in the world, positioning Canada's exports as some of the cleanest LNG available on global markets. Behind the engineering stands a consortium with global reach. A $40 billion joint venture led by Shell has brought together Petronas of Malaysia, PetroChina, Japan's Mitsubishi, and South Korea's KOGAS. Each partner secures not only investment but also long-term access, tying Canada's Pacific outlet directly into the supply chains of Asia's largest economies. Equally significant is who holds ownership at home. The Haisla Nation and the Nisga'a Nation are not marginal participants but direct stakeholders in projects like Cedar LNG and Casey Leesome's LNG. Their involvement has secured over $4.7 billion in contracts for local businesses, with nearly $3.8 billion flowing specifically to Indigenous enterprises. For Canada, that represents more than economics. It is a blueprint for inclusive growth, one where energy expansion strengthens communities that had long been sidelined. If clean technology and Indigenous ownership anchor LNG Canada at home, it is Asia that secures its future abroad. The first wave of contracts has already tied Kitimat directly into the energy security strategies of the world's largest importers. Japan's JERA, the country's biggest power utility, has signed a memorandum of understanding with Shell Canada to purchase LNG directly from the Pacific coast, an arrangement that bypasses the traditional U.S. middleman entirely. South Korea's KOGAS has gone even further, stepping in not only as a buyer but as a strategic investor. That position gives Seoul priority access to volumes at a time when competition for LNG is intensifying across the region. China, meanwhile, has been embedded from the very beginning through PetroChina's role in the joint venture. Its contracts extend out to 2040, effectively locking Beijing into decades of Canadian supply. Together, Japan, South Korea, and China form more than just a customer base. They are constructing a marketing platform that guarantees stable offtake for the first phase of Kitimat's output, ensuring that the project is not exposed to the volatility of spot markets. For Canada, that means predictable revenues stretching across decades. For Asia, it means a secure, low-carbon supply line at a moment when energy competition defines national strategy. The contrast could not be sharper. For decades, the United States set the terms of Canada's energy trade, enjoying a steady flow of discounted gas that reinforced its own security while limiting Ottawa's options. But by the second half of 2025, that equation had flipped. The U.S. no longer held leverage. It had lost it. With tariffs still in place, Washington suddenly faced the disappearance of cheap Canadian LNG. Forced to look farther afield, American buyers turned to suppliers in the Middle East and West Africa, routes that added distance, time, and cost. What had once been a reliable, low-cost pipeline connection became a vulnerability, exposing just how fragile U.S. energy planning had become. Canada, meanwhile, was busy opening what some observers now call its Western Artery, a Pacific corridor that bypassed the old continental system entirely. By the third quarter of 2025, imports of LNG from Canada into the U.S. had fallen sharply, revealing the structural weakness of Washington's position. At the same moment, Canada was strengthening its brand abroad, a reliable, low-emission supplier aligned with the long-term needs of Asia's energy giants. In less than a year, the narrative had shifted from dependence to leadership. Ottawa was no longer the junior partner in North America's energy relationship. It was positioning itself as a contender in the global race for influence. What makes Canada's LNG pivot more than a temporary adjustment is the set of structural advantages baked into its geography and technology. Independence alone would be significant, but Ottawa now competes with tools that Washington simply does not have. Start with distance. From Kitimat, LNG can reach Asian buyers in only 10 days, a route barely half the length of America's shipments through the Panama Canal, which typically take 20. That time gap translates into lower shipping costs, more predictable delivery schedules, and a built-in edge in negotiations with utilities that prize reliability. The liquefaction process itself is also more efficient. Thanks to Canada's colder climate and hydro-powered facilities, LNG production operates with energy savings of roughly 26% compared to U.S. plants. Lower costs at the point of liquefaction reinforce competitiveness before a single ship even leaves port. Pricing further tilts the scale. The AECO benchmark in Canada consistently sits below America's Henry Hub, giving exporters another cost advantage when bidding for contracts in Asia. And environmental performance may be the sharpest weapon of all. Canadian LNG carries an emissions footprint of just 0.15% CO2 per ton, less than half the global average. For nations balancing energy demand with climate commitments, that distinction is not just attractive, it is strategic. Together, these advantages suggest that Canada is not merely breaking free from U.S. influence, but building a platform strong enough to challenge it in markets where efficiency, cost, and carbon intensity increasingly decide the winners. Kitimat today represents more than a port. It stands as a symbol of how the global energy map is being redrawn. Canada's reserves are vast, with estimates suggesting 1,566 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, enough to last for 3 centuries at current rates of consumption. That scale underpins an export potential of up to 56 million tons of LNG per year, a volume capable of adding $11 billion annually to Canada's GDP, while creating nearly 96,000 jobs across provinces. For governments in Ottawa and British Columbia, the benefits extend beyond employment and growth. Long-term projections point to as much as $150 billion in combined federal and provincial revenues, securing fiscal space for decades. And because Indigenous partnerships are at the heart of these projects, the wealth generated circulates back into communities that had too often been excluded from major resource developments. Layered on top of this domestic framework is the unrelenting demand from Asia. Together, these elements combine into a possibility few expected even a decade ago. Canada not just as a reliable supplier, but as a rising energy power in its own right, which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Has Washington, by pushing its closest ally away, set the stage for its own loss of leadership in the global energy order? This story is far from over. As Canada builds out its Pacific corridor, the balance of energy influence may continue to tilt, away from Washington and toward markets that once looked far beyond North America. What other shifts might unfold if allies turned rivals begin competing head-to-head for the same buyers? And more importantly, can the U.S. afford to underestimate its northern neighbor any longer? Thanks for watching, and if this resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every click fuels the truth.